Okay. We are going into public. Okay. Thank you very much. So we're now in public session. Just my normal thing, just to remind everybody to turn off your mobile phones, please, in relation to recording and the interference that it causes to the microphones. I'd like to welcome representatives from both Dublin Chamber and Chambers Ireland to our meeting today. We thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, this is part of our pre-budget consultation process feeding into our pre-budget report. So we are being joined by Dublin Chamber's lead speaker is Mary Rose Burke, and you're accompanied, I gather, by Owen Quigley and Fergus Sharp. And from Chamber Ireland, where we are being represented by Mr. Ian Talbot, and you are accompanied by Aidan Doyle. So, as I said, my thanks to you all for coming in to us. Before we hear opening statements, I just obviously would like to just remind you of the privilege statement. So I wish to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So, with that bit of formal privileged housekeeping over, for today's session I'm going to ask for the opening statement from Dublin Chamber, and then we'll follow it by Chambers Ireland. Then I will be opening it up to members to take questions. So, Ms Rose Burke, I'd ask you to, if you would, make your opening statement.
I'd like to thank the Committee on Budgetary Oversight for its invitation to discuss the priorities and recommendations for Budget 2020. Dublin Chamber is the largest chamber of commerce in Ireland, representing over 1,300 businesses across the Greater Dublin area. Our diverse membership base gives us a strong insight into the needs both of businesses and their employees, informing a holistic view of the commercial environment. And our vision is that Dublin will be globally renowned both for its economic competitiveness and its quality of life. We have a duty to our members to highlight issues of concern and to highlight the public policy changes that are needed to improve the business environment. And as a civic actor, the Chamber strives to do this in a way that supports the needs of the community at large. We're acutely aware of the challenges facing the business community and the government in the face of a no-deal Brexit, and the decision to base Budget 2020 on a no-deal scenario is a prudent one in light of current uncertainty. Deputies will notice that while some of the goals in our submission are ambitious, we've also outlined several targeted measures that could be more easily accommodated within the fiscal constraints of a single year, even a year such as 2020. The Government has a package of circa 600 million remaining unallocated in Budget 2020. Dublin Chamber recommends the use of these resources to prepare for the challenges ahead by strengthening the fundamentals of the economy. This should involve supporting Irish enterprise, ensuring sustainable infrastructure and housing investment, and improving labour market access. Ahead of Brexit, the Chamber has compared the environment for enterprise in Ireland and in the UK. As outlined on page 4 of our submission, Ireland now lags across the UK on a range of metrics. Foreign direct investment is vital to the Irish economy, but as the global environment changes, so too our business model must adapt, remaining attractive to foreign investors while avoiding excessive reliance on a small number of highly mobile firms. We need to foster an entrepreneurial environment and to strengthen Ireland's indigenous base, and this will require a step change in the level of investment by SMEs. Ireland's capital gains tax rate is now the third highest in Europe. Worse still, the flat 33% rate applies irrespective of the contribution of the investment to the Irish economy. The same tax is paid on passive investments in large blue-chip multinationals as on high-risk Irish start-ups. This effectively incentivises investment in large foreign firms over investment in Irish SMEs. We embrace the ambition of moving towards a 20% rate of capital gains tax for all unlisted trading firms. Conscious that this may have significant exchequer implications in the short term, we've also outlined a number of targeted measures that could be adopted more quickly. And these should be considered both as steps to improve competitiveness and as possible tax expenditure, as in a post-Brexit stimulus package. First among them is our proposal to outmatch the UK on capital gains tax entrepreneur relief by raising the lifetime cap on qualifying gains to 15 million. We've also proposed changes to the R&D tax credit, the taxation of entrepreneurs' dividends and the key employee engagement programme. And while progress on all fronts is not possible in one fiscal year, there is scope within the budgetary parameters to send a strong signal that Ireland intends to sharpen its competitive edge in the face of Brexit. Infrastructure and housing consistently rank as the most important challenges facing businesses in Dublin. Joined-up thinking between housing and infrastructure development will be key to addressing Dublin's deficits in these areas. Projects like Metro North, the DART expansion programme, the Eastern and Midlands water supply are essential to ensuring a sustainable future for the Greater Dublin area. The announcement of the National Development Plan was welcomed by the business community, but it is critical that government follows through. There is serious concern that in the event of a downturn, capital investment will be cut, as has often been the case before. Steps must be taken to guarantee delivery of the infrastructure improvements the economy so badly needs. There are three practical things the government could do to ensure the next time it will be different. First, if the economic growth dips below the levels required to fund the National Development Plan, drawdown from the Rainy Day Fund should be permitted to ensure steady delivery. This would meet the fund's short-term aim of economic stabilisation through stimulus while also building future capacity. Second, all parties should commit to reasonable use of excess revenues. Last year, the corporation tax take was around 1.4 billion ahead of target. Raising current spending on the basis of unexpected receipts is a recipe for instability. Such revenues should be used to accelerate priority projects or to bolster the Rainy Day Fund. Third, the revenue from future carbon tax increases should be ring-fenced for green infrastructure investment. Dublin Chamber fully accepts the need for the carbon tax while calling for a clear schedule of planned increases to ensure that businesses can plan and adapt in good time. But securing public buy-in will be very difficult if the government punishes carbon use without providing alternatives. Improving public transport is the place to start. The final concern I'll bring to your attention is the tightening labour market. While this reflects a good news story in some aspects, we must remain cognizant of the immediate challenges it poses to scaling businesses and the potential risk to Dublin's competitiveness. There's still major scope to raise female labour market participation. The cost of childcare and the combined effects of the tax and social welfare system appear to have a depressing effect on the female participation rate at present. Addressing this would improve the situation considerably. Dublin Chamber called on the Government to focus on improving the universal component of the National Childcare Scheme in 2020 and to carefully assess the scheme's incentive effects on labour market participation. We've also proposed for future consideration a returning to work credit to reduce the marginal tax benefit rate for second earners in a family who are returning to work. In conclusion, we're conscious that Budget 2020 comes at a delicate time, but as the last budget before the UK's exit from the EU, it offers an opportunity for Ireland to demonstrate serious intent about business competitiveness versus the UK, as well as its commitment to long-term planning for sustainable infrastructure investment and improved quality of life. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to exchanging views with you.
And thank you very much for your opening statement there. I would now like to ask Mr. Ian Talbot, on behalf of Chambers Ireland, if you could do your opening statement.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach and deputies. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us here today, and I'll be sharing my time with Heydon Doyle, the Chief Executive of the Sligo Chamber of Commerce, who will add a regional dimension to the discussion. As many members of the committee will know, Chambers Ireland is Ireland's largest business network, with a geographic footprint that extends across the country, 41 chambers, of which Dublin Chamber is our largest. And we're delighted this morning we launched a new Laois Chamber with about 350 people in a room. So we feel it's a very vibrant network at this point in time. Every one of you have chambers of commerce in your constituency, and no doubt you'll be glad to see their representatives at our network's event tomorrow morning, to which you've all been invited. We welcome the Brexit-driven approach which the Government is taking to Budget 2020 as a necessity, and believe it would be foolhardy to take a business-as-usual approach. The first-order effects of Brexit will hit certain exposed sectors of the economy, agri-food, tourism and so on, where we know issues will arise as a direct consequence. But the second-order effects will likely have a broader impact, potentially depressing consumer spending, for example, in regional areas quite significantly. Therefore, we think it is wise to assume the worst, seeking to leave the national balance sheet in as robust a position as possible, ready to respond. I think that those in the business community who are most likely to be affected by Brexit have taken actions necessary to minimise its effects on their businesses. For example, rerouting logistics in a way which is unlikely to change regardless of what happens next with Brexit. But this has imposed additional costs on Irish businesses, and they will continue. And assuming Brexit occurs, there will be further hits to the economy. This kind of external shock is likely to have a strong immediate impact on our economic growth at the national level, the duration of which is unclear, but we have no doubt that we'll all be collaborating to address the regional impacts of Brexit for a considerable time to come. But while Brexit consumes so much of our policy discourse, we must not lose sight of the longer-term challenges that Ireland will meet. It was with this longer-term perspective that Chambers Ireland formed our pre-budgetary submission. That submission is centred on the decarbonisation of our society and the necessary mitigation and adaptation strategies which follow from that. Firstly, there is broad acceptance in the business community of the need for carbon taxes, but it is vital that the proceeds of such taxes do not flow into the general fund. Already over 400 million is collected annually through carbon tax, and we welcome the early indications from the Taoiseach that ring fencing will be the chosen approach by government. It is vital that the current revenue and future increases are ring-fenced and channelled into schemes and infrastructure which will allow people to access lower carbon alternatives. Increased carbon taxes which are not complemented with investment in grid infrastructure, public transport and retrofitting will have a disproportionate impact on poorer people and remoter parts of the country. Furthermore, to help businesses budget for increases to the carbon tax, we believe there should be a schedule for such increases, which will have the double effect of not only helping business to plan for them, but also bringing greater predictability to the present value of energy efficiency measures, thereby encouraging viable investment. At an infrastructure level, our energy networks need to transition towards meeting the challenges posed by the growth in renewable energy sources, while also maintaining energy security and continuity of service. To cope with the added demands which government policy relating to e-vehicles and the full electrification of home heating places upon our electricity network, the generation and transmission capacity of our grid will need to be expanded. This will require considerable investment and needs to be a priority area. Unless we can achieve this, we will not be able to meet our emissions targets and the related fines will continue to grow. Finally, we need to see that the investments which are in line with the principles of the National Development Plan are continued. These investments, particularly around public transport, are necessary for the long-term reduction in our society's carbon intensity, but also because these investments will act as a counter-cyclical ballast against the economic headwinds that are before us, allowing our economy to maintain momentum during difficult times. I'll now hand over to Heydon Doyle.
Cathaoirleach, Deputies, Senators. Sligo, as a designated regional centre of growth under Ireland 2040, is a city that faces the many challenges that every urban area in Ireland experiences. Lack of planning and underinvestment has undermined the economies of regional cities and towns, contributing to the donutting that happened in large cities like Dublin, and this leads to long commutes and suburban sprawl. This is continuing across the country, and we want to see this process reversed. The kind of economic stimulus for towns and cities like Sligo is to have people working and living in the heart of them. Places like Cork, Dublin and Limerick have the Living City initiative aimed at protecting the Georgian parts of these towns by bringing life back to them. The Living City initiative is a tax incentive scheme for special regeneration areas in Ireland's major cities, through which tax relief can be claimed for expenditure on converting residential or commercial properties. We believe that the expansion of the Living City initiative to Sligo and other regional towns and cities, with the extension of this initiative beyond the current May 2020 deadline, will enhance the regeneration of our regional towns and cities and will attract people back living above shops and restaurants in buildings that are hundreds of years old, and that's the kind of living that people want. The planning problems which make above-shop conversions nearly impossible will need to be fixed. And we'll need good transport, local transport services, protected bicycle lanes, decent transport links and proper broadband. But it's a lot easier to build these in towns than it is to service mile after mile of new housing and one-off builds. And people making homes where we already have schools, water infrastructure, doctors and all the other government services makes much more sense than having people drive 50 miles in and out of work every day and trying to serve the spread out population at the same level. In regions such as the North West, businesses have higher energy costs and a larger carbon footprint, making the region less attractive to those seeking to set up business. One of the reasons for this is that Sligo is not linked to the gas grid. To enable balanced regional development, Sligo in the North West needs to have a similar quality of infrastructure as is available to more successful regions, both to attract new industries and to allow those already established to be competitive both nationally and globally. In Sligo, we're working closely with the local authority, the agencies and industry on a compressed natural gas project transported from the National Gas Transmission Network, and will facilitate the move away from other more polluting fossil fuels, especially oil and diesel. Without this facility, the region is essentially denied the associated cost savings, CO2 reductions and air quality improvements that CNG transport options provide by replacing diesel fuel for heavy and road transport and to aid the transition to a low carbon economy. These are just some of the things that local businesses in Ireland are looking to make happen. But our planning systems, including our marine planning system and how we invest in national infrastructure, will need to recognise this and to facilitate the kind of progress that we need. Life is for a living, and our state organisations should be assisting regional cities and towns across the country, including Sligo, to develop and attract new investment as places where people want to work and live. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Mr. Talbot and Mr. Doyle, for your opening statement there. So I'm now going to open it up, obviously, to questions from deputies. Deputy Burton has indicated, so I'll open it up to her first.
Thank you, and I very much welcome the Chambers here today. And I have to say, probably rather unexpectedly, I agree with quite an amount of the presentation, particularly, I would say, the comments by Heydon about Sligo and about making it a living city, even if it's a small city. And what I want to say is that while I agree with the emphasis in the document and welcome the emphasis on transport, I think at the moment, in terms of Dublin City is facing a crisis in which its very character is under siege from financial money people who are literally gouging the heart out of the city, making the city as unaffordable as Manhattan is for families, and turning Dublin into a city where it relies extensively now on tourism in terms of huge number of jobs. But if it keeps going the way it's going, Dublin is not going to be recognisable as the Dublin of living city with families and people living in it, particularly in terms of the broader city centre between the canals. And we are actually going to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. I want in particular to make a reference to the style of development that's been encouraged under the Strategic Housing Initiative in terms of co-living developments. Every week now we are seeing in different parts of the city, including as recently as last week in the suburb of Blanchardstown, a co-living proposal for 210 bedrooms. Now, all I can say is that the business spokespeople need to wake up in relation to this type of development, which is imposing living spaces on people in their 20s and 30s, for all we know, maybe into their 40s, 50s and 60s, which means that they will be paying rent so expensive that they will never be in a position to save, to buy a home. And so we will have an end, certainly in our cities, to having a home-owning democracy, and that's what I'm afraid Fine Gael government will have delivered. So what I would like to know is, in terms of, particularly in relation to the presentation in Dublin, on Dublin, which in a way, I think, if the Sligo one was read as being for Dublin, it would be as well. It would be one, I think, that we would recognise a vibrant urban space with good traffic, transport systems, with opportunities to walk, to cycle, and so on in terms of being in the city. Family living and attractive family living being possible. All of that at the moment is being driven out of Dublin by a super financialised model, which is actually leading to the emptying out of the city. Now, what I want to ask the Dublin Chamber is, are you concerned about the future of Dublin? We know, for instance, lots of venues in Dublin are disappearing, from theatres to pubs. They are all just falling before globalised finance, which wants to invest in Dublin because the returns in Dublin are bigger than the rental returns, renting out bedrooms, bigger return than the rental returns in a place like California. And, you know, I really feel that the Chambers, because you represent businesses, I think you probably know what this is like. If you're looking as well to have workers, the people who are going to be able to afford these rents are not going to be able to live near where they're likely to be living. So I do think there's a crisis developing in relation to Dublin, and I'd just like to know if Dublin Chamber has a sense of that. As I say, I agree with a lot of the presentation, but to be perfectly honest, we're like the run into the last crash. We are now overdeveloping at a point where we risk bringing the whole thing down on everybody's head.
Thank you, Deputy. Now, I don't know who wants to come back in first.
I'll respond to that one. We did a recent survey of our members, and the cost and availability of housing is an issue for 2/3 of businesses. So businesses are very cognisant of the impact on this on their employees. It creates great difficulties in filling open positions when people can't find roles. The average national salary at 45,000 and the average Dublin rent over 2,000, and the asking price is out of reach for anybody on that type of a salary as well. We've put a lot of thought into some of the solutions that we can put forward on that, and we know that that lack of residential capability in the city is putting a drag on the economy and will into the future. We know we need to get greater density, and I agree with the Deputy in terms of, particularly within the Canal Cordon, the first element of a livable city, and Dublin Chamber has always focused on both the economic and social well-being of the city. So the first element is about being an active walking, cycling city, then a reliance on public transport once you get outside the walking, cycling distances. But that densification, and we know that even just adding one storey onto a 1 acre site gives you 20 new housing units. So we need densification in all ways, not just in height, but greater densification and infill on brownfield sites. In our submission, we've identified quite a number of sites that are available that we feel should be focused on, like the Jamestown Business Park in Finglas, the Dublin Industrial Estate in Glasnevin, sites near Malahide Road in Coolock, and a large tranche along the Naas Road. We do feel those should be a priority for infill along public transport routes. So I agree, absolutely, housing is a critical issue for the economy, for our individual businesses. Businesses are, its number one and number two issues are infrastructure, transport and housing. Those are the issues that come up constantly. They shouldn't be business issues, but they are, and we've identified a lot of proposals in that, also addressing social housing. And we do feel that while HAP and other elements like that are useful, really we need to see social housing provision accelerated by government to increase the overall supply side on the number of houses.
Mr. Talbot, Mr. Doherty.
Well, really, just note, our submission focuses on countrywide aspects. If you look at our detailed submission, we've a very strong set of recommendations on housing. I mean, Chambers are, as business organisations, we're very, very strongly connected to placemaking and communities. So we want to see us building our cities and towns as places to live, work, educate, and basically have a high quality of life.
Thank you very much. Now, Deputy Breathnach, your next indication. Yes, I have two more after you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd just like to start by commending Chamber of Ireland, and particularly as a rural deputy, the Chambers, particularly in my own constituency, both in Dundalk and Drogheda, both on membership and the staff, in terms of the excellent work to do on behalf of business people and the community. I've always found it a go-to organisation, I have to say, both in my time in public life, but equally their contribution to the strategic policy committees, and in terms of the overall development of my region, I have to say their contribution is excellent and their help and response to public representation is superb. I want to just deal with a couple of quick questions. Can you in Chambers Ireland and the Dublin Chambers set out for the committee the cost of the proposed budget measures that you've put forward in your pre-budget submissions? Your submission also calls for the issue of just spoken about the sustainable and affordable housing. What budget measures would you propose to implement in order to address this? And could the witnesses suggest any other budgetary measures that would be worth pursuing to help with increasing labour supply? In addition to that, certainly I want to commend the whole issue of the Living City initiatives and to say, is there a strategy among the chambers to make sure that the various locations that are looking for Living City initiatives, such as in my own region of Dundalk and Drogheda, is there a conjoint approach to that, and how is that progressing? On a personal issue of 3 quick items, and Chairman, as you know, I don't take my 5 minutes and I won't be coming back. What strikes me as somebody who I suppose is relatively new to coming into Gridlock Dublin as relatively new Dáil deputies in 2016, are you finding or addressing solutions to solve the gridlock on the M1? It's blatantly obvious to me from 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm anxious to know what debates are going on in relation to the movement of lorries are gridlocking, probably not just the M1, but I'm sure plenty of the other accesses. And it strikes me that a lot of those are heading, obviously, to the port for times of boats and ships. And what incentives, or are you looking at what incentives could be used to get those lorries into the port at an earlier time that would obviously help people who are trying to commute into the city? My last 2 relate to obviously the context of Brexit, and that is has the Chamber a view in relation to the need for an all-Ireland economic zone on the island that would solve a lot of the issues, I think, around single market and the difficulties with trade? And finally, do you or have you looked at the whole issue of the impact of the proposed duty-free tariffs or regimes that are going to be introduced in the context of a no deal, and what impact it will have on your business, as certainly it's going to have a huge impact on the border region, and I'm sure the type of goods that we're talking about are going to impact on your business communities within the Dublin and the wider region. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. And as always, with about a minute to spare, so maybe I will go first to you, Eamon, this time round from Chambers.
Thank you. Look, it's nice of you to come to me first. And thank you, Deputy. You used your few minutes very well there to get a few questions in. Dealing with several of the issues. First of all, the cost of our proposed budget measures, the thrust of our budget measures really are to keep the capital investment going, and the capital investment has been clearly outlined. So while I think you could have some debate about which project should be in the capital plan and so on, I mean, for us around the country, we're desperately crying out for investment to make up for that 10-year gap that we had during our recession and financial crisis. And our strong message is that no matter what happens, we need to keep that investment going and not have that lull. So from that perspective, we feel that there's very little financial implication of our budgetary thrust. It's about ensuring we spend the money. And that, towards your conversation at the end, that's a vitally important thing for the Brexit debate as well, that we continue to ensure that Ireland's ports, roads, airports and so on continue to facilitate more complex trade, which is going to arise. In terms of sustainable and affordable housing, as we've already mentioned, we've a strong set of recommendations on sustainable and affordable housing. At a Chambers Ireland level, we're seeking to come up with an overlay of the challenges facing our big cities, our growing cities under the National Project Ireland 2040, and towns such as Sligo, Athlone and Dundalk and Drogheda that got the special status in the Project Ireland 2040 as well. And the Deputy would be very familiar of the work of people like colleagues like Paddy Malone, Eddie Field and Shona McManus in your relative chambers on the M1 corridor. And we very much leave it to those chambers. And Paddy Malone, for example, would have presented at previous budgetary committee discussions on the work they're doing on those areas, and the great work they're doing on growing that whole Drogheda Dundalk corridor. which is fantastic. On labour supply, again, in Chambers Ireland recommendations, we have a very strong set of recommendations on an inclusive and future-focused workforce, including access to quality childcare and how we can encourage more female participation in the workforce. Greater participation there, I think, is one of the things and opportunities for us, but we're very conscious that the shortage of housing creates difficulties in people moving towards jobs, and also the opportunity to bring resources into the country that can help us through the labour shortages. On things like the All-Ireland Economic Zone, I would hesitate to come up with a view on that. I mean, it's still developing, but we're talking very closely to our chambers in Border counties. It's great to have Heydon here from Sligo, and we're speaking regularly to Letterkenny, Dundalk, Drogheda, Cavan, Cootehill and so on about the issues they're facing, and obviously it's very challenging, so we're all as focused as we can be on the issues that are potentially going to arise. On the impact of the proposed duty-free, we haven't looked at the detail from a national perspective, the impact of the duty-free. I would like to think, though, that if you compare the level of trade activity that Ireland undertakes with both the UK and the rest of the world in 2019 versus the level of economic activity and exporting in 1994, I think they're two very different numbers, and I would hope it's not as significant an impact as it might have had in 93, 94, when I recall clearly a media concern, in particular the duty-free, the loss of duty-free would have a big impact. Those are my comments.
Good luck.
Like to come in on that?
Sure, just on costings, I suppose, as Ian Talbot has said in relation to the capital plans, those are largely outlined, and our focus on infrastructure really has been not so much on outlining new spending plans as suggesting fiscal measures that could be put in place to ensure that spending plans in the capital envelope will actually be delivered consistently as planned over the coming years. Our lead feature in our own submission has been in the enterprise space, and certainly any proposal that we have there, to the extent that we've been able to cost it, a cost is included. Our headline ask has been about cutting capital gains tax for unlisted trading firms to 20%, which would start to compete with the UK, which has introduced a similar scheme called Investor Relief, specifically with a view to encouraging equity investment in its SME base. Thanks to a parliamentary question which Deputy Quinlivan's colleague Pearse Doherty submitted for us last year, we were able to get an idea of the Department of Finance's thinking on this and how much work they had done on it, with a view to seeing where Ireland was in comparison with the UK on investor relief. And we were told that the Department is unable to calculate the cost of introducing the same scheme as the UK because tax returns don't identify the amount of the chargeable gains that are associated specifically with unlisted firms. Cuts in CGT and the cost for every 5%, we'll say, or less, are outlined in the tax strategy group papers, but those, of course, are tax or are static costings, I beg your pardon. And it's worth bearing in mind that, of course, the whole point of this proposal is to be to have an effect on changing the pattern of investment towards unquoted firms rather than listed firms. So you would need a dynamic costing rather than a static one. We do appreciate that it would have in the short term at least, probably significant exchequer implications, which is why we've, as Mary Rose outlined, suggested this as a goal to move to in the medium term, while outlining a couple of more targeted measures that could be adopted in Budget 2020 and in coming years. And we've led with entrepreneur relief. Our request to raise the lifetime cap on qualifying gains to 15 million in the case of entrepreneur relief would cost 84 million. That's a static costing again from the Department of Finance. The proposal on the R&D tax credit would cost 30 million, and in terms of the reduction on income tax on dividends for entrepreneurs to 30%, we'd be looking at something less than 95 million. I say less because the 95 million estimate is what it would cost to reduce the rate of income tax on income from shared dividends in Irish resident companies universally to 30%, limiting that, of course, to shares received by entrepreneurs or dividends from shares sold by entrepreneurs would limit that to a fraction of that figure. But further details are in our submission.
Okay.
Gridlock, just the issue of gridlock.
The gridlock of the M1 situation.
Yes, well, in terms of gridlock in Dublin, it's consistently raised by our members as a serious issue. I think it's also worth pointing out that it has a measurable cost to the economy. The Department of Transport has estimated the annual cost to the Irish economy of gridlock and traffic congestion in the Greater Dublin area at around €350 million per annum. That's due to rise to €2 billion per annum by 2031. And when you take into consideration the impact of future carbon fines, it would be a larger figure. We have a range of proposals in terms of what infrastructure projects we think should be prioritised, and those are outlined in our infrastructure section as well. We're also working with the local authorities to try and promote investment in cycling as a means of addressing that.
Thank you very much. Deputy Quinlivan.
Thanks very much, Chairperson, and thanks very much to the Chamber of Ireland for their contributions. Particularly want to mention the one in Limerick. It's been very successful, very professional, very had a huge impact, and a lot of the revitalisation has went on in our city or whatever. Mary Rose, you mentioned in your contribution about FDI being critically important to the Irish economy, and I agree 100% with you there. But you said this needs to be a step change by SMEs in the investment, the way we do it, and maybe we'll have a more stable economy if we do that. So recently, with my colleague Deputy Imelda Munster, we launched a policy on an Irish enterprise agency, which would be similar to the idea, but would have a focus on SMEs. And the idea behind that was to look at the role of LEOs and how some of them work really well, but others don't work as well, to try and make that more coordinated. So would you have an opinion on an idea like that to go forward with that? And I was interested in Eamon Doyle's comments on the Limerick City, or the Live in City initiative. I just wondered what pitfalls you see in that. Now, we have it in Limerick for a number of years, and it hasn't been hugely successful, but we would like to see what you think we could do to tweak that, to make that better, not just for Limerick, obviously, but for regional cities, like our regional towns, like you spoke about yourself, like Sligo. Gridlock was a massive problem, as other deputies have referred to. I don't drive to Dublin for the reason of it's quicker to come on public transport from Limerick. I can walk to the local train station in Limerick, and I can get to Lewis when I get off here. But I did drive once or twice, and it takes much longer to drive from Limerick to the Dáil than it does to come on public transport. So we should look at maybe enhancing public transport a lot better than we do. And just to come to the two main topics that we're talking about, which would be Brexit and climate change, and I know you identified that clearly in your submissions, but how would you square that then when they are the two biggest, probably generational challenges we're going to face in the next number of years? And how do you square that with your call for, you want to seek a reduction in capital gains tax, or dividends, or tax cuts? How do you square that? We do need to have the investment. For instance, in a detailed submission, Cork Chamber of Commerce, for instance, only 10% of the members thought the tax cuts should be the emphasis in budget, whereas 40% of the members said it should be improving public services. So how can you improve public services if you want to cut taxes? Dublin Chamber for themselves are calling for the extension of the SARP regime to SMEs, and this is a terribly, I believe, terribly discredited regime. 18 people who earned over £1 million in 2016 benefit from this tax break, and 18 million of tax breaks are very high earners at the last cost. So how do you see the extension of this scheme to SMEs benefiting a country facing a hard Brexit and the serious crisis we have coming with climate change? Thank you.
I'll just address some of those comments very briefly, and then I'll ask Owen to come back on some of the issues. Foreign direct investment has been the backbone of our industrial policy since late 50s into the 60s, and has been hugely successful. Our foreign direct investment is probably responsible for about half of economic output, about a third of the jobs. So while over 99% of the enterprises in the country are SMEs, they employ about a third of the people. The Future Jobs Report has identified a number of areas that need to be addressed, and we're working with our businesses to identify those around use of technology, particularly in productivity, and with the aim to ultimately make those businesses be able to grow and be bigger businesses. However, there are institutional barriers. We also need to identify those SMEs who need support to grow, not the SMEs who do not wish to grow. There is a certain cohort that we need to be able to identify the ambition and growth and support that, and we have a number of proposals in place to deal with those, and Eamon will talk us through those. So I think it's, in the long term, we need to broaden the economic base in terms of jobs and economic output. While not dialing down on foreign direct investment, it's more about lifting up the productivity of our SME sector. So I'll ask Owen to talk us through some of the specific initiatives that we've described in the proposal.
Yeah, so what we're looking at are targeted approaches to support enterprise. And you referred to Cork Chamber's comments in terms of tax cuts. We had similar comments from our members in terms of preferring investment in infrastructure and housing to tax cuts. But there's different forms of taxation. So our income tax regime is broadly based and highly progressive. When it comes to corporate taxes, our key ask is to apply a lower tax rate of 20% to certain types of gains. And we've sought to target those in areas that will help to broaden the economy. The Irish entrepreneurs, they're subject to a tax of 33% on all gains. Relative to the UK, our closest neighbour, where there's a 10% tax rate applying to them on gains of up to 10 million. We feel that is a disadvantageous net position. Based on the costings that Fergus referred to, the costings of increasing our entrepreneurs' relief, say, up to 15 million euros, or only 80-something million in total. Now, that's based on a static costing model. It's been found before in the past when capital gains tax rates were reduced by the Fianna Fáil government back by Charlie McCreevy. The capital gains tax take actually doubled. So the impact of reducing capital gains taxes, what it does affect is it brings capital gains back into being subject to tax. When entrepreneurs have a choice to essentially sell their businesses and are able to structure in ways whereby CGT is either arises or not, entrepreneurs, typically successful entrepreneurs, have choices as to whether to stay in Ireland and reinvest and to be serial entrepreneurs, or perhaps to go abroad and not pay tax here at all. So when we talk about tax reductions, we're talking about very targeted tax reductions to help stimulate and support a constituency, which is a small constituency, who are contributing to the broadening of our base. Basically, what we've done brilliantly in this country over the last 50, 60 years is embrace FDI. That is becoming, there's a lot of headwinds in that space. And what we are trying to focus in on is being proactive in supporting our Indigenous entrepreneurial base. Because with the headwinds that are coming in, the international tax changes which are running against Ireland, and our brilliant tax policies that we've had for many years, we have to embrace what we can control. We can't control international tax policy changes, but we can control how we treat our domestic entrepreneurs. So the targeted measures that we're looking at are sort of improving entrepreneurs' relief, and also, Mary Rose mentioned it in her opening statement, a targeted relief, or not relief, but lower rate applying to investment in small or medium-sized companies. That is designed to focus activity in active companies that are contributing to employment and the robustness of our economy. So whilst they are reductions, we feel that they are productive reductions and focused reductions in tax, which ultimately we would hope that, based on experience of the past, will actually yield more tax than actually be net costings. And in that sense, Mary Rose referred to potentially phasing in some of these measures. Based on the fact that there is some fiscal space in the current environment, and based on that historic experience of capital gains tax reductions yielding more tax, there could be merit, and we're suggesting there is merit, in being somewhat brave in embracing these changes and just seeing what impact they have on our economy. There are certain other measures that we've just focused in on. I'll just quickly deal with, such as R&D, tax credits. That measure for business, we're talking about applying upfront cash refunds to SMEs. SMEs are in desperate need of cash. That's costed 30 million, but I think that again would be sort of stimulative. And then just jumping quickly to SARP, you've referred to particular aspects of SARP which are widely covered in the media and how there have been uses of it at high wages. What we have in our submission is a measure of applying SARP for SMEs. So SMEs are competing and seeking to compete with the multinational sector. The multinational sector are very exciting, brilliant companies. They're able to offer their employees share options, big remuneration packages, job security, which jobs in the private SME sector don't readily attract or cannot advertise in the same way. So, so I'm jumping around slightly. We've referred to some measures for improving the KEEP regime to make it more applicable to help attract employees into those SME areas. But also on the SARP side, there's a war for talent in our city. We're in a very good economic condition. But again, the multinationals have the ability to pull in foreign talent, which helps develop and embed their businesses in Ireland. What we are asking for is a level playing field for our SMEs to bring in talent to help our SMEs get established. We are looking at that as the number of people who would have availed of SARP in that €1 million level that you've referred to would be relatively small. SARP is a very valuable relief for many businesses, and in looking to apply it to SMEs, I'd say there'd be very few, if any, SMEs that would be looking to be paying people in excess of $1 million. SMEs are looking to bring in key talent, and getting to that level playing field, I think, is a question. There's a question of fairness, and I think in terms of what it can do for the economy and embedding the SMEs and supporting them, I think is well worth considering.
Do you want to come in there on that as well, Eamon?
Yes, please. Deputy, first of all, thank you for your comments about Limerick, and I think it's a very good example of how Limerick County Council under Con and the local chamber working together has certainly helped there as well, and Limerick's looking great these days, so well done to all concerned there. The concept of help for our SMEs, and yes, there is the gap where the IDA are helping FDIs and Enterprise Ireland are helping a limited number of high potential startups, and the LEOs are down at the sort of County Enterprise Board Plus level. The one thing I'd say to you is that what we're working very closely on as an organisation is to try and make sure that our chambers are coming forward with a single message in every county, and that message of looking for investment and engagement with the local authority and the LEO in their area. And we see actually that there's real potential for LEOs and chambers working together in local authorities, and just potentially have a concern about a new organisation with new funding actually pushing chambers out. I mean, a chamber network, we're called not-for-profit. It's a frustrating description because we have to go out and we have to encourage members to join and pay us money to do the work that we do. So, we don't like to see us being frozen out by additional state investment in an area where we think we can really help. So I think, yes, there's room for it. We'd like to think that the structures are potentially already there if we give the right signals to your network of state organisations and to our network of chambers to work together to invest in those areas. Just the whole area of public transport as well, and going back to the M1 issues and so on. Again, this is why in our submission we've really focused on the need to continue to invest in public transport. You look at things like, I was delighted to see that this week Éireann Éireann has been able to invest in capital stock for the first time in 10 years. So, for example, Deputy Breathnach, I live in Malahide, so I see the Dundalk trains coming in and how jammed they are, and I see that people leaving Malahide drive into town every morning and wonder why they don't get the DART, but to some extent it's because at key times there aren't enough or it's very full. So that critical investment to make the most of infrastructure we already have, and the need to keep putting in new structures such as the new metro project are vital for us as well. And to make sure that we're learning as we're building growing cities under the National Planning Framework Project Ireland 2040. We make sure we learn from what Dublin did right and what we could have done better, for example, as we build out those cities as well. On Brexit and climate change, tomorrow, in fact, the Chambers Ireland will be bringing out an announcement that all of our chambers around the country have signed up to a pledge on the Sustainable Development Goals. So, again, as a network, going back to our community base, we're very focused on the need to drive business forward on climate change. You look at things like the necessary changes we're going to need to make in, for example, our grid and types of fuels we use and so on, and the potential to retool people around the country to work on climate change projects, for example, rather than traditional power generation projects. And tying in there, we need to encourage entrepreneurs, and we need to encourage increased entrepreneurial activity. We need to encourage people to go out with new ideas, start up new businesses, and so on. So that's, I think, why we'll always, I think we're very focused on infrastructure this year, we'll always in the background have things that we need to encourage our entrepreneurs, and we encourage people to become entrepreneurs and have a go and generate more employment and generate some additional wealth which we can push into the economy. And Heydon, do you want to talk about the LCI?
Yes, thank you, Deputy, for the question. I think it's interesting the fact that you mentioned about Limerick and the Living City initiative and the challenges that are there. I suppose we understand that the initiative is there for older buildings, so it's buildings that are over 100 years old. So, yeah, so I think, we're here today, and we would like to see to broaden the remit, not just for old buildings, but also for long-term vacant commercial properties and residential properties. I know from working in the Atlantic Economic Corridor up the west coast, you will find that a lot of the urban towns and cities on the AEC regularly appear high up on the vacant property stats. So that's one of the reasons that we think that we believe that it should not only be extended past May 2020, but also included in other urban towns in the country, and as well as including the long-term vacant commercial properties in that.
Deputy Quinlivan, you have about just under a minute, so if you'd like to come back in.
Very quick follow-up then with Mr. Talbot. Just to clarify what I was saying there about Irish Enterprise Agency, it wasn't to displace chambers, but it was to strengthen LEOs that I believe do very good work in some areas, but don't do it in other areas. And business people would tell me that themselves. They struggle with their LEOs in some parts. And I know from some business people I've met, they went to the LEO and they got no help whatsoever, kind of thing. But a bit of a more coordinated approach there to strengthen our economy that we're not totally reliant on, which is crucial, FDI, but not totally reliant on it. So thanks for your response.
Thank you very much, Deputy Quinlivan. And Deputy Broughan, you had indicated next.
Thanks, Carla. Yeah, just to return to taxation, is this the year, though, to be changing or introducing, whether it's entrepreneur relief or capital gains or whatever? Is this the budget to be even contemplating those kind of changes? Given the fact that we had a Brexit debate, we have one virtually every week, every day here now, but last week we were, a key issue would be what the Minister did, what Minister Donoghue did last year with his €300 million, and what may have to happen if we get, say, if we still, and today's news I suppose is encouraging for everybody, but if we still get a massive hit to our revenues of maybe €6 billion in the following year. So the first point, should we be thinking along these terms at all? And even when you mention capital gains, if you look back, I suppose the Charlie McCreevy era, it was a fundamentally different era, I think. At that particular time, the world has really moved on very seriously since then. So is it not time to echo the Minister in some respects, is it not time to be prudent, in a couple of weeks' time on taxation? Just in relation to wages, in relation to the demand side, what do the chambers do to encourage members to, pay, say, a living wage, to move towards that level of wages in, would say, the vast area of service firms that we're familiar with in the high street and so on and so forth. Have you got a policy of encouraging companies that are doing quite well to pay workers, at a premium, and to therefore stimulate demand? Obviously, if people are better paid, they have more money to spend in the economy. And is that something you've given any consideration to? Just in relation to decarbonisation, say the car business, the car industry, I'm sure you have members around the country. Do you think that they've done enough, or have they done anything whatsoever, in fact, in many cases, to encourage people, to move towards EVs or to move towards hybrids or whatever? Because we've heard from, I think, SEMA, one of your sister organisations, the motor industry body, that, the 2030 targets are simply impossible, that we couldn't do, like we couldn't be like a Norway and roll out 90,000 chargers or whatever it is. The Norwegians have, or those kind of encouragements in that regard. Just to ask you as well, you mentioned there about Indigenous business. Obviously, Indigenous business can be very, very heavily impacted by reliance on the British market and obviously north-south trade and so on and so forth. It is kind of linked to, isn't it, to FDI, because many companies, of course, have flourished as contractors, as all kinds of providing, like cleaning, you name it, all kinds of services to the Googles up the road and so on and so forth. And you're echoing the Taoiseach, I see, for hypothecated taxes. We haven't really ever done that before, but I think most economists would say there is a strong case now, because the concern a lot of us would have, by the way, is for the poorer households, that it's great to be moving towards 2025, 2030 targets or whatever, but that the levels of fuel poverty that we've seen in the past, affecting maybe 15% of our people, 20%, are so profound that we can't afford to leave them behind. Just the last point, just maybe on our city. I think we should be striving that our Sligo and Limerick and so and our great cities around the country, that they will become really vibrant regional centres, and that Dublin will be a world-class capital. It struck me there recently, in a capital that's a city in Europe that's only maybe about a third the size of Dublin, that they have a tram to the airport. And we don't, and they've done that in the last couple of years. No kinds of big debates about all kinds of hysteria and anxiety and so on. They just went and done it, but we still don't. Which is, and a lot of our city, we don't have fixed line. Cork, we don't. We're still waiting for the Lewis for Cork. We're waiting for the Lewis for Galway.
Deputy Broughan, thank you. You are over time.
Okay, so I'm just wondering about, and that area infrastructure, if the chambers could be doing more to hassle the government to deliver.
Okay, thank you very much, Deputy. Mary Rose, do you want to come in maybe first on this one?
And we consistently lobby government and all departments on various elements of infrastructure. Infrastructure is the building block for a future competitive city. We work under the umbrella of Dublin 2050 in terms of, we try to envisage what will a competitive city in 2050 look like, and what is a city that people will choose to live, work, invest, study and visit, and all of the elements that make a competitive city. And it's very multi-layered, and it touches on areas of placemaking as such that Ian mentioned as well. So very much seeing where are the competitive cities and what do they do well. When we benchmark across other competitive cities, they typically have a very good public transport system, and they typically have affordable and accessible housing. And it's no surprise that that's coming up through the business community around some of the biggest challenges. When it comes to some of the tax issues that you mentioned, of whether this is the budget to do it, we're very much in the space that it is important to have a prudent budget. We equally have to be careful not to have Brexit goggles on. Come what may with Brexit, or whether there's changes in America that influence a global investment, or whether it comes from the East, there will always be challenges. And for a small globalised country, we have to very much look at what's within our own control and what can we do about our own competitiveness and attractiveness as a place to live, to work, to invest, and how we can create jobs there. And Owen went into some detail on some of the tax measures, particularly to support entrepreneurship, that would very much help that competitiveness and help us to create jobs and help sustainable businesses here in Ireland. And it really goes contrary to the national interest that we would incentivise people to invest in blue chip companies and not invest in Indigenous Irish companies that need investment. And an ESRI report has identified that there's about $1 billion of missed investment of what should have been invested in SMEs if they were to operate at the same level of productivity and innovation. We know SMEs want to invest in research and innovation. However, because of the cash tightness, they can't. And therefore, we've brought forward measures that would stimulate that type of activity. And we need that level of job creation, of R&D and of innovation to build out a sustainable Indigenous business base that will protect us regardless of the challenges. There is a risk of a very, very competitive UK. Already they're more attractive than us for entrepreneurs. So whether they stay or whether they leave, we need to look at what's within our own control. I don't know, Owen, if there's anything you want to build on the specifics of that.
No, I think you've covered everything. But, yeah, like you mentioned the requirement for prudence, which everyone would agree with, I think. But it is a time to be proactive as well. And on that point on Brexit, like the UK has a wonderful regime for entrepreneurs and for supporting their entrepreneurs. It also has a wonderful, a more favourable personal tax regime for Irish entrepreneurs who might want to locate to the UK. So we, in preparing for Brexit, who knows what way it will go. But I think this area is an area in which we are exposed because they have moved to be much more attractive from a tax perspective over the last number of years. Their tax rate is at 17%. Okay, they have a much larger economy than ours, but that's getting closer and closer to a 12.5% tax rate. So to a certain extent, we have to mark our closest neighbour in preparing for Brexit, because if they get clear of the European Union, as obviously a lot of politicians in the UK wish, they will be free of a lot of the state aid restrictions that we have here. There are certain things that we can bring in, applying to SMEs, broad-based targeted measures, which I think will be, I think the term proactive would be better than prudent in one sense here, because they're not imprudent. And when you get away from the static costings, I would have a very strong belief, and I think most economists would agree, that these targeted capital gains tax measures that we're suggesting will yield more tax, if anything, than cost us.
Thank you very much. Eamon, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I'll come in on a few of those topics as well. Thank you, Cathaoirleach. And thank you, Deputy, for your questions as well. In terms of Chambers encouraging companies what to do, first of all, I do want to point out that I guess we all get frustrated by joiners and non-joiners, and our collective membership across the network is about 10,000 members, which means about 190,000 companies or trading enterprises aren't members of ours, and we possibly appeal to certain types of company around the country, and different policies work at different times. But I will go back to something I mentioned earlier, which is tomorrow we're bringing out a pledge that chambers are going to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals. So things like quality of work is a key component of that. So that is an area we're focused on. The car industry, I suppose, we're all looking at the numbers for 2030, and it's clearly a very substantial change we need to make. A key point at the moment is just, though, that alternatives exist for people to migrate to, and at the moment there's still a very serious concern that, for example, there aren't enough charging points. There's issues around, hogging of charging points that there are, and so on. And in the last 12 months, I've been to both Norway and to Finland and had a look at the relative performance there. And in Norway, really every second car now is an electric car. And it's based on a combination of a couple of things. First of all, a huge range of incentives to encourage people to buy electric cars, including things like free parking, as well as significantly reduced taxation and things like that. But also, and something I hadn't thought of, they had a significant number. Most houses already had a charging point because they plug in their cars during the winter to keep the battery protected. So they already had an infrastructure that now incidentally enables them to roll out a huge number of charging points very rapidly. So that's something we don't have. So that's an extra challenge for us. But we do need alternatives, and we need some sort of carrot and stick incentives. So we need some sort of, some more carrots. And there is a question of expense. I mean, electric cars, I think, for mass market still look very expensive. And I guess until globally more people start buying electric cars so the production lines get more efficient and bring the prices down, we're in a challenge. But yes, it is a big challenge, but we can't ignore it either, and we have to start keep making progress and make some tough decisions on this. Areas such as fuel poverty, that is a concern, and I pretty much mentioned that in my opening statement. I didn't use the words fuel poverty, but very much we need the grid to protect the poorest in our society, who are going to find that, for example, carbon tax will have a disproportionate impact, for example, on a bag of coal. So, we really need to invest in our grid infrastructure and alternative technologies to bring forward the opportunity to make sure that we can either subsidise people that are challenged, or to give people viable alternatives. And then just, I suppose, it's just a huge bugbear for us as a network is that we're constantly calling for capital projects to be delivered, and there are constant challenges around, for a long time, for example, finding the investment and then the planning process and how things can get deferred. If you look recently, for example, Cork Chamber were very vociferous, for example, when the Dunkettle roundabout project for Cork, which is obviously a vital piece of infrastructure in that area, was deferred for a year. But when we explored it as well, there's an argument there as well that the procurement system is working, because the procurement system is saying, we need to reevaluate this to make sure we're getting value for money and we don't get a big cost overrun. But time ticks by with all these things. So it's an enormous infrastructure that some of the big, for example, more tram lines, Dart Underground, all those things in Dublin and in other cities aren't happening quick enough. And our population is growing, and people's quality of life has been impacted. This is an enormous issue for us, and I think we're on the same page on that, to be honest, Deputy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Just on the R&D tax credit, rather than given the, if you like, the limited amount of money that may be available for any discretionary budget measures with Brexit and all the rest of it, why would you not argue for redirecting some of the R&D that is currently disproportionately benefiting a small group of IT companies and big multinational corporations, rather than looking for an extension of the R&D to those that maybe aren't getting it? I mean, the R&D tax credit has gone up to about 700 million. Right, it's absolutely ballooned, and that is overwhelmingly going to a handful of multinational corporations whose names we're all very familiar with. Right? Shouldn't that money be redirected towards developing a sustainable domestic economy, both to SMEs and indeed to our public universities, rather than saying let's extend the tax break to another group of people? Shouldn't it be about redirecting it? So I just want to put that, because that's certainly what I think should happen. I don't see why, Apple should get an R&D tax credit for coming up with the latest upgrade on their phone to the Apple 11, right? It doesn't seem to me like a priority. Why don't we put that money into stuff that will benefit the domestic economy? Would you also say, just following on from what Tommy said, that any consideration the Minister for Finance might be having of holding back on social welfare increases, any measures that might, if you like, reduce the spending power of ordinary people, working people, would be completely the wrong thing to do in the face of Brexit or a possible international recession? That actually we should be boosting the purchasing power of ordinary people, and that would benefit your members, but also prevent, if you like, suffering and hardship being visited on ordinary working people in the face of economic turbulence or difficulty. And then on the, I welcome your comments about public transport, about childcare, infrastructure, and so on. But could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on that? Okay, I mean, what do we mean when we say invest more in public transport? For both climate reasons and just congestion and so on. What I think is we should move to free public transport. That would really encourage people. That we need much greater frequency on public transport routes, much more reliability, and we need public transport routes that aren't for profit, right? That will go into areas where it's not necessarily commercially viable in a narrow sense, but where it will actually get people into public transport. Do you agree with that? And that therefore we need a heavily subsidised public transport system. And you could make the same argument about childcare. And very last question, what do you say, because this is a blight in our area, right, and many areas, vacant shop units, over-the-shop units and so on, which really infuriates people, right? What do you think should be done to stop that happening, where you have empty units littering the main street of Dunleary, for example, for years on end?
Ian, I think we'll start with you on this one. And
now, I'm no expert in the R&D, and I don't know whether only you might be able to talk about that one. The Minister for Finance choice to make around things like social welfare change, we've certainly not gone out. We've prioritised in our debate here this morning, from Chamber's Ireland perspective, the need to invest in infrastructure. And if you look back as well at the context of, we've written this main document, several weeks ago, and as Brexit has continued to evolve, we've become increasingly aware of the need to focus on a Brexit-focused budget and retaining capital investment as a core. So we've not formed any views on whether social welfare should be increased or not. We just focused on what business is looking for to get to keep a strong business environment out there and keep businesses employing people, generating revenue, paying taxes, paying VAT, paying PAY, PRSI, and so on. I think in terms of what do we mean by investment in public transport. Again, across our network, we've very significant consistent asks around investment in public transport. We've consistently gone out on things, as I mentioned earlier, things like the Lahart Underground, Metro North, which has evolved into the Metro project, for example. And just in terms of the need to service particular areas, again, if we can extend that network, and we've been looking at things like now I'm straying into Dublin's expertise here, but it's learning from Dublin's experience in developing other cities are important to us. But looking at the Bus Connects concepts and how that's looking to evolve. And what a lot of it comes back to is, first of all, the need to keep securing investment, to keep putting money into these projects, which Chambers will continue to support. They'll absolutely continue to support. And the second thing is how we ensure that the planning system is capable of ensuring that we can deliver these programmes in good time and at a reasonable expense. And again, we look back to things like the DART infrastructure, which you'll be well familiar with, obviously, as well. Inroad Air still have plans, and there's the plan to move the Northern Line down to the Docklands, for example. We need to go ahead with these things. We need to explain to people, of course, what it's going to mean, and people might be slightly accommodated from a journey they're used to, but we need to explain that, as a city, and as for our cities around the country, as we're going to live in a sustainable fashion in the future, we need to detach ourselves from cars, and we need to have the right public transport infrastructure in place. That's what Chambers consistently call for. And the vacant shop units, again, we have some recommendations on the vacant shop units. We agree we're equally concerned about vacant shop units, and it's not just in Dunleary, where you've a very prominent shop yourself. Not
vacant though.
Not vacant. Far from it. Very active.
I'm glad you're keeping an eye on me.
No. That section. It's a lovely walk through. There's great variety on that street. Now, at other places around the country, we have some, for example, large stores being left vacant as well, which are causing concerns for some of our chambers around the country. So it's very much an issue, and it goes back to our desire to see town centres to grow and thrive and create communities. So we're very much in favour of measures to ensure that many of these issues are challenged and brought forward.
Sure. I suppose on the prudence point, I don't think we're suggesting that the aim of Budget 2020 should be to hold down purchasing power. nothing like it. And I think in terms of the budgetary package that's available, unallocated, there's room to adopt targeted measures in a couple of different areas. We've proposed several for consideration in the enterprise space. I think in terms of the cost of living issue, which is the broader issue that you're getting at, the main issue there, I think, isn't so much wage costs at the moment. We've actually quite a buoyant labour market, but the high cost of living due to issues like housing and public transport. So that's why the focus is there. In terms of specifics around public transport, that there are other cities in which free public transport services can work and have worked. I'm not sure whether Dublin is in the space to start adopting that on a large scale just yet. I think the main problem that the Dublin has at the moment is that it's not there, the infrastructure isn't really there, rather than there's a price issue for the average commuter. And that's why we've detailed a lot of projects that we think need to be prioritised. We're talking about what's now called the DART expansion programme to cover a number of different improvements to the DART system for several years. The underground element, the DART interconnector, has been talked about in one form or another since 1971. There's virtually no progress about half a century later. It's been subject to multiple plans, revisions, postponements. In the absence of any progress on that, it's now being looked at again for some sort of lower cost technical solution. In the absence of any progress on that, we would like to see improvements to, or progress on other elements of the DART expansion programme, and to make sure that we don't do the same thing with Metrolink, that we at least deliver the northern element of that project. In terms of the R&D tax credit, I suppose our short answer would be it's not an either-or. There certainly is an SME need for it. I might defer to Owen on that for the specifics on the R&D tax credit.
On the R&D tax credit, I think your question was broadly around the actual credit itself and retaining the credit itself. And you mentioned costings of 700 million, and the question, why should we be incentivising Apple in the creation of the iPhone 11. And in answer to all of that, the overall contribution of foreign multinationals, I touched on it earlier, to our economy has been quite spectacular. We're a small economy, peripheral economy on the edge of Europe. The amount of multinationals who are located here and who are spending money here has been the bedrock of our economy. And what has evolved in the last number of years is a real focus on having real substance in countries. And for us to attract the substance, we need to be, for the knowledge-based economy that we seek to be, we want to be attracting the development of the IP, because with the IP comes the jobs. And if you mentioned 700 million costing for the R&D tax credit. I would say that that is exceptionally good value in terms of the jobs that brings into the economy. Because what is the R&D tax credit for? It is a credit for qualifying expenditure, which is typically expenditure on high-paying skilled workers. Those skilled workers, they're employed here, and once multinationals typically have a cluster of people here, they will bring further projects here, or those skills are here and available for our SME sector and for the broader economy. So I would think that the value of the R&D credit in helping to embed the multinationals, that the value of that for our overall economy is, I think, 700 million, if anything, is extremely good value, and it should be protected. In our own submission, our piece on R&D tax credit is focused on making the R&D tax credit more attractive for SMEs. SMEs, for early stage companies, it's all about cash. Our R&D tax credit works in an offset against corporate tax for the larger multinationals. But for SMEs, they're often not paying tax, and at the moment there's a staggered repayment or payout of R&D tax credits, typically as an offset against PAYE over a 3-year term. That is typically for SMEs who need cash up front. What we're really suggesting is bringing that forward, and we've suggested consideration of lifting the 25% R&D tax credit to 30% for SMEs to help support that sector. And again, I just focus on the stimulative impact in terms of what these credits bring to the economy should be considered, and not the cost.
You only have about 30 seconds if you want to come in on something there, or do you want to leave it and I'll let
just on housing, Would you accept there's a big problem of gentrification going on, or if you want to put it even more dramatically, social cleansing of areas like the inner city and indeed some of the suburbs, my own area, because of the punitive cost, the exorbitant cost of rent, home purchases, and the lack of social housing delivery from the government, and the crowding out then of sites and so on by cuckoo funds, or the purchases by cuckoo funds who are then renting out at exorbitant prices? Would you accept that that's a problem and something that needs to be addressed?
Who wants to maybe just comment on that briefly?
Our biggest issue is the lack of housing supply. That's the fundamental cause of the problem, is that there is more demand than there is supply. We need a multifaceted response to that, and in a vibrant city and a global capital, you need a mosaic of different types of housing provided for the variety of people that live in the city. I think when I look from when I was a student in the 80s in Dublin to the vibrancy of the city centre now, nobody wants to go back to those days, but that's what happens when you jump from a population of 3.3 to 4.7. We have a massive demand for housing without the associated public policy that provided for a housing policy for everybody. So there's a particular issue at the sharp end of it where you see homelessness and where you see the reliance on social housing, and where there have been measures around the housing assistance payment. And we've identified in our proposal that we don't think that's the long-term solution, that we do think that there should be some provision and building of houses by government for social housing across the country, and particularly in Dublin.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to actually go to Deputy Chambers now.
Thank you. And thank you for your attendance at the committee. I'm not going to labour and go over things that have already been discussed, and obviously Brexit is the key thing that's dominating all of our days and sometimes our nights as well. And today's been a particularly, I think, incredible day, and one that we'll certainly, I think, study in the coming years. But I think you're correct, Mayor Rosen, that we can only control the things that we can control. And we have to look at our own preparations and how best we can, with the limited resources that we have, buffer our own businesses and protect our citizens as best we can, because even in the event of a deal, we are still going to face considerable challenges, because there will be a change to the trading environment. And while there might be some little bumps for Dublin in terms of maybe financial services, really for the rest of the country it's going to be quite a challenge for us. And I'm really glad to see Mr Doyle here actually representing the west of Ireland. That's where I'm from, and I'm in a very rural constituency in Mayo, so a neighbour of your own, Heydon. And I think there's a particular concern around the regions in the event of Brexit, but even just more generally, as Dublin grows and grows and struggles with the challenges of an ever-growing and fast-growing city, the regions are finding it difficult to compete. And I was in Sligo over the weekend. It's come on a lot, I think, in the last number of years. I think the development around the Garvogue is really good, and you've got a good theatre there. There's lots happening, and there's a good tech industry building up there as well. That's really exciting. And certainly, you've mentioned, I know, in your opening statement, Ireland 2040. It is the hope, I think, of the entire Western region that Sligo will grow and that we'll all grow together as one region. I'm sure you recall that the final draft of Ireland 2040 didn't actually include Sligo. Which, to my amazement, when I looked at the map in Ireland 2040, this was meant to be the final draft. There wasn't supposed to be a huge amount of tweaking at that point. It was compiled after a long process of consultation and all ministers having their say. And, I was gobsmacked to look at the map and see that there was nothing for the North West. You could draw a line from Galway to Dublin, and there was nothing north of that. And we fought very hard to get a regional growth centre, and it was, I think, a good win for the North West to get Sligo on that map. And I hope that it will pay dividends not just for Sligo but for Donegal and Mayo and in Reacham as well, that we might grow together. Just in terms of the infrastructural demands for the North West, we don't have... there are complaints in Dublin that the Dart is overcrowded and the Lewis is too slow. We don't really have public transport, so that's our biggest complaint. We don't have motorways. We have the odd dual carriageway, and even our national routes are in a poor standing. So from Chambers Ireland's perspective, what are the priority pieces of infrastructure for the North West, for that region, to assist it to grow? Yeah. And just in terms then of you refer to the planning process, the problems in the planning process. Could you give a little bit more detail as to what those issues are? I know, take for example, the Athenry Apple data centre has kind of thrown open some challenges. I think a lot of that was the courts process, in that it was quite slow on appeal and moving through the court system. But are there other issues in the planning process itself that you think could be addressed in the short term to try and make it a bit easier to move the planning thing along? And just in terms of, met with IBEC West yesterday in Medtronic in Galway, and all of them, I suppose the large multinationals were represented at that meeting, and the key message from all of them actually was that they're struggling to attract talent and to retain talent. Housing is playing into that. They're finding it difficult to house people. They're finding it difficult to attract people in engineering and science and mathematics, and to retain those persons. And from your own perspective, is there something within Budget 2020 that we could perhaps do to try and address the talent issue?
Thank you, Deputy. Whoever would like to open up first.
Okay.
Heydon.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Just to answer a couple of your questions, I suppose, when you talk about the Northwest, and mainly really talking about the Atlantic Economic Corridor, the biggest challenge is connectivity, and it's probably connectivity between Donegal down as far as Cork.
Yeah.
We talk about Brexit, it is a challenge. We don't know what's going to happen, but certainly you would see, we would envisage there to be a lot more traffic coming down through the west coast, especially in the northwest, rather than going through the north. For instance, when your the destination is Dublin Port, and I think there's another opportunity for the northwest is opening up the ports, expanding the ports, and you're talking about probably Killybegs and then as far as Foynes. So the biggest challenge ahead with Brexit is connectivity within the west coast. Also, you're looking at the planning process. I suppose for places in the northwest and the west, it's taken a while for development to be established again. Nothing has really happened since 2006. It's starting to happen. You're looking at towns. I think that the word vibrant was used a few times today. It's very important that the towns, like in Castlebar and Mayo and Sligo and those places, is that it's seeing that they're vibrant towns. When companies are looking to invest in places like that, that's the first thing that they look at, is that there is a vibrant town, and that there's that people are living within the towns and cities, etc. So the planning process has to be relaxed a little bit on that. It was mentioned today about living over shops. It's very important that the process is there, that it's easy to get the planning to allow that to happen, and that there are incentives, like we were talking about the living in city incentives, that they're there.
Be extended to the other towns.
And they're extended to rural cities and towns, and that they're not restrictive in the sense that we're looking at certainly vacant properties that are there and have been there for quite a while. So that it's important that we push that agenda. And as regards to talent, I suppose from looking at our own members, we are aware that if we look at the demographics of the people who are looking to move to the west of Ireland, to the northwest, it is the people who want to live in the cities. Talent is there, and I think it's very important that we have the education for them. We're looking at IT Sligo in association with GMIT and Letterkenny IT that they are applying for technical university status next year, so that's key to it, because it's not only are we going to attract more talent, but that we have talent for the next 5 to 10 years available. So it's very important that we keep that issue is there and that it's being addressed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy Chambers, for your comments. Just to, I'm sure you'll recall that Chambers Ireland and our chambers in the regions were very, very strong on that last draft of the National Development Plan to get Sligo and also Dundalk and Drogheda and something in the Midlands into the plan as well. So we share your concern there. I think Heydon's dealt comprehensively with the specific issues in the Northwest, just on the planning issue. It's a bit of the danger of, you come up with a good idea and you end up implementing it. You put planning as a concern down, everyone says, well, what would you do to change it? And clearly it's very complicated. I mean, the Athenry situation, I suppose, ultimately it was the length of time it was taking.
To go through the courts process.
Through the courts process. And ultimately, I think the project was ultimately approved in the Supreme Court, but by that stage the investor had just moved on and was weary of the process, which is understandable. And some of that was the fact that there was a lack of ability to control who could actually object to a project on one side of the country from another side of the country.
Correct.
And again, ultimately, I think that was overturned, but it took court process and time to go through that. But I know there's constitutional issues then about limiting who can object, so that's a challenge as well. And certainly some of the, we accept it's very difficult, but we have some, in our detail, for example, we have some recommendations around how the Land Development Agency, for example, might be given some more compulsory acquisition powers, CPO powers, to help specific challenges we're facing on vacant sites and so on. But unfortunately, it just seems there's no quick, easy solution. I guess it's a bit like Brexit. If the ideal solution was there, somebody would have thought of it by now, and clearly on planning it's a similar issue. But it's a big worry for business to see people and the amount of time and effort and energy invested in the planning process and the risk that you're taking and the money you're spending and the weariness of people who have an idea and they want to get on with it is a real challenge. So I don't think we can let that drop down the list of major concerns.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of comments to that. Thank you, Deputy Chambers. Conscious that your question was very much rooted in the Northwest region, but as part of one of the initiatives we did in 2018 was a national conversation around the country where Dublin Chamber pretty much went on a roadshow to the other cities listed in the National Development Plan and went to Waterford, Cork, Limerick and Galway, very much asking them what do they want for and from their capital city. And I suppose the upshot was a shared understanding between the cities that the issues facing cities as centres of economic growth were similar. Housing and transport were issues for everybody. Attractiveness as a place to bring talent, and in a knowledge economy the jobs follow the talent. We also look internationally and we understand that the cities and urban areas that do very well are those that have academic, business and political leadership that come together with a vision for the area. And that they take the long-term view. Very often we hear, and I certainly understand the frustration sometimes when people, and Deputy Barrett mentioned about empty shops and that. By the time your main street has empty shops on it, that's just an outcome from previous policy decisions. Typically, when you examine towns where that has happened, you'll see that the cinema or the swimming pool or the schools or the supermarkets all moved out to the edges. And retail is a footfall feeder, not a footfall driver. So by the time your main street has empty shops, the issues have happened 30 years beforehand. So I think we do need to learn from where things have worked well and how we plan our urban centres. And I think we also need to have a grown-up conversation about the future being urban in Ireland. And that's the international and global trend towards urbanisation. City regions will be the economic hubs for their areas and how we support them properly. So very much we're clear that Dublin doesn't compete with Galway or with the Midwest or any other area. Rather, we're competing with other international economic centres, and if something is lost to Dublin, it's lost to the country. It's not available for disbursement around the city. So I think we need to pull together, and we know that countries where their capital city is successful and where the reputation of the city internally is strong, and we've a big piece of work that we're just finalising on that we'll be sharing with various deputies. So I think there's a number of issues there around city regions, around urbanisation and around that leadership, but also decrying a current problem without understanding the root cause that typically has happened about 20 years ago.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are almost running bang on time for this part of our session today. So can I thank you very much for coming into us. can I thank all the deputies who engaged with you on it. It is very much part of our process to building towards our report, which we're hoping to have finalised towards the end of this week. So with that, I am going to conclude this part and suspend for approximately 5 minutes, and we will come back to commence our next session. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming in. session. Just before we go into public session, just to remind everybody that we have to be out. This meeting has to conclude by 3:15 today, and we have another piece of substantive work to do as well. So we are in public session. Can I just obviously make the reminder, as always, on phones? I would like to begin this part of our public session by welcoming representatives from Screen Producers Ireland. That's Elaine Geraghty, and accompanied today by Siobhan Ward and Stephen Rook. Thank you for attending our session here today. Can I just, to remind you of the statement on privilege, to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(I) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence concerned with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any other person or entity by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that we should not comment on or criticise or make charges against a person outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So with that privilege statement concluded, Ms Geraghty, I'd now invite you to make your opening statement to us.
Thank you very much, Chair, and members of the committee, for the opportunity to contribute today to the committee's work on tax expenditures. My name is Elaine Geraghty. I'm the CEO of Screen Producers Ireland, and here with me today are two of our members and our colleagues producers. Siobhan Ward of Crossing the Line Films produced such content as The Game, The Farthest and A Wild Irish Year, and Stephen Rook of Tile Films produced Aerial Ireland, Sacred Sites and A Terrible Beauty. Before I speak about Section 481 and its importance to our Irish screen industry, I want to provide a brief overview about Screen Producers Ireland and our members' work. Screen Producers Ireland is the national representative organisation of over 100 independent film, television and animation production companies. The Irish independent production sector comprises a diverse range of companies, different sizes and spread across the country, producing content for television, cinema release and online distribution. These companies, the majority of whom are in the SME bracket, produce high-quality content, both in English and in Irish, which is culturally relevant and loved by Irish and global audiences. Irish independent productions have been lauded worldwide, including this year when Spy member Element Pictures produced The Favourite, a multi-nominated Oscar-winning film. Other film and TV drama productions made by our members include Fastnet Films produced Black 47, Samson Films Float Like a Butterfly, Ripple World Pictures Never Grow Old, Abu Media, Finky and Metropolitan Films produced TV drama Vikings. Television productions made by our members include IndiePix, Ear to the Ground, Coco Content, First Dates Ireland, Crossing the Line Films, producers of The Game, and Sea Fever, who produced Ireland's Deep Atlantic, and Tile, who I've said produced Sacred Sites. Just in terms of what we do and the role of a producer, in the Irish film and TV sector, it is a vibrant industry and it has a sophisticated infrastructure of production companies, studios, service companies and expertise, all of which provide valuable employment in the Irish economy. Irish producers within that infrastructure are entrepreneurs who contribute significantly to the enterprise economy and in a way bridge the divide between commerce and culture. Producers are responsible for creative, financial, statutory management of the individual projects in which they're involved, and they're engaged in all elements of production from the earliest stage of commissioning of concept, rights acquisition, development, sourcing of finance, pre-production, production, post-production to delivery, marketing, distribution and compliance. Financing production is challenging and funding opportunities can be limited. Available funding for producing content includes a mixture: TV licence fee, Broadcasting Authority of Ireland Sound and Vision funding, Creative Europe media funding, the Irish Language Broadcasting Fund, Section 481 tax relief and indeed private financing. And in this funding mix, the importance of Section 481 cannot be underestimated. Ireland has a long history of supporting the Irish TV and film industry through fiscal incentives, the most important of which was originally introduced in 1987, that's 481. And while having experienced a number of iterations over the years, Section 481 remains a crucial component. It's a crucial component to the sustainability and growth of the Irish independent production sector and is absolutely necessary if Ireland's film and TV industry is to continue to develop and thrive, because those countries with which Ireland competes have similar or comparable incentives, a point also made by the Irish Tax Institute when they appeared in front of this committee a couple of weeks ago. The Government commissioned Allsberg Spine Ordicity company to conduct an economic analysis of the Irish audiovisual industry, and it defined the importance of Section 481 as underpinning the Irish film and TV industry. It provides vital finance to enable Irish producers to make local projects with local content in Ireland, ensures Irish producers remain attractive to international co-production partners, and places Ireland as a globally competitive location for co-productions and high-budget inward investment productions. The analysis recommended the extension of Section 481 to 2024 and as one of many recommendations to support the growth and sustainability of the Irish screen industry. The last available full-year total committed figures for 2017 show a spend of €292 million in the Irish economy as a direct result of 481 certified projects. This was spent on goods, services and labour across TV drama, documentary, film and animation. There were 85 certified projects in that year, comprising 11 from animation, 17 from TV drama, 17 from film and 32 from documentary. Over the last 4 years, there have been some significant big-budget TV drama projects. I'm sure you're familiar with them. They include Ripper Street, Night Flyers, which was made in Troy, Vikings and Into the Badlands. However, it's also interesting to note that the majority of productions in Ireland are in the €1 million and under budget range. And for example, over the years 2016, 17 and 18, the percentage of productions whose Section 481 eligible expenditure budgets were €1 million or less was 79%, 85% and 83% respectively. It reflects the fact that the majority of Irish production companies are in that SME bracket. In the run-up to Budget 2019, we engaged with the Department of Finance and Revenue on the possibility of extending Section 481 beyond 2020. Now, this engagement has led to better understanding between all stakeholders on the operation of the incentive and to ongoing engagement, which in fact has been very, very helpful. In October last year, the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donoghue, announced the extension of Section 481 to run until December 2024, advising that the extension of the incentive was to support the continued growth of the film industry in Ireland. The Minister also announced a new time-limited regional uplift of up to an additional 5%, and this will taper out over a 4-year period. The uplift will support the development of new local pools of talent in areas outside the current main production hubs, which tend to be Dublin and Wicklow. And this will help to increase the geographic spread of the screen sector in Ireland and support the overall cultural objective of having an established and sustainable screen industry in Ireland. Significantly, the tax incentive moved to a self-assessment model, which came into effect in March of this year. We believe that this move will make the application process more efficient in the long term, and in the meantime, we look forward to the publication of a new set of guidelines by Revenue related to eligible expenditure. The announcement of the extension was welcome and very important, as the lead-in time for film, TV and animation projects from initiation, development to financing and production can span several years. Certainty around the long-term availability of Section 481 is crucial to provide confidence and security to both the indigenous industry and to ensure we can continue to attract direct inward investment by international studios and producers. Speaking about Section 481 in May last, the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, Josefa Madigan, has said that Section 481 is a key and central component of the Irish screen sector. We support this statement by the Minister for Culture, which shows the Government's commitment to supporting a strong, vibrant Irish Indigenous film industry. Delivering quality employment is an obligation of Section 481. The Irish producer company itself employs a core full-time staff who work in the areas of production, development, administration, sales and marketing. That core staff are involved at all stages of delivering a production in a process that often takes, as I've said earlier, possibly 3 to 4 years. Crew are then hired when a project moves to the production stage and for the duration of that project. And crew comprise a mix of PAYE and self-employed individuals. The independent production sector, industry provides significant employment opportunities for crew. The Department of Culture commissioned Alsberg report into the economic activity in the audiovisual sector for 2016, where it stated that there are over 7,070 full-time equivalents of employment in the live-action film, TV and animation sectors. And these sectors of the industry contribute 692 million in GVA and generate 184 million in export earnings. Our crew are some of the best in the industry and act as a strong attractor for projects. This is in part because skills development has always been core to the production industry in Ireland, but also because Ireland has been able to attract a diverse range of projects enabled by Section 481. The introduction of the new skills development requirements as part of Section 481 application criteria means that we can continue to build upon this while allowing us to capture data and information with regards to skills development. We can track career pathways in the industry, as well as identifying and addressing skills gaps. In conclusion, Section 481 has a positive impact on the creation of indigenously produced content. It attracts incoming production and has a positive impact on the creation of quality employment. It contributes to Ireland's reputation as a global hub for high-tech digital and creative content, and it has a direct impact on attracting tourism to our country. The result is that Ireland has become a very attractive location for incoming film and TV production, but is able to support indigenous production at the same time. And expenditure in the Irish economy as a result of Section 481 clearly illustrates the need for Ireland to maintain and continue to improve its fiscal incentive as required. Be very happy to take any of your questions, as would my colleagues Siobhan and Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine, for that very comprehensive opening statement. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Thanks, and thanks to Spy for their presentation. I want to sort of say, before I ask a number of questions, that I'm very much in favour of the state providing support to the arts sector and to film and all of the arts, and indeed I would welcome a very significant increase in the budgets for those things. However, I'm not, as I suspect you know, convinced that Section 481, the way it's structured, is actually achieving the ends that we would want in terms of the provision of quality employment and training, which is the legal requirement of Section 481, or the development of companies of scale, which is indeed something that 24 years ago the Indicon report said should be the purpose of Section 481. And indeed, the Indicon report at that time strongly criticised the project-by-project nature of the Irish film industry, and said that the Section 481, or Section 35 as it was then, was actually encouraging and perpetuating a project-by-project, short-term film industry, which would not result in the development of companies of scale. I would further point out that the EU, in its guidelines on state aid to the audiovisual sector, pointed out that that aid should deliver the consolidation of the industry through the creation of soundly based production undertakings and the development of a permanent pool of human skills and experience. Now, I want to put it to you, Elaine, that none of that is happening. Okay, that none of it is happening. So, for example, yourselves and others who are supporters of 481 came into the Arts Committee a year and a half ago and said there were 17,000 whole-time equivalents, which sounds good. Today you've used the figure of 7,000, but there was a counterpoint put at that committee, as you know, from the workers in the industry, who said actually the figure was nearer 2,000, and that very few of those, if any, were secure jobs. On foot of that debate, the Minister asked for an investigation into it, a study of it, and concluded, I quote, "In 2016, the Revenue Commissioners estimate the number of employees directly engaged in Section 481 productions are 2,158. Okay, so in other words, Spy and other supporters, based on those figures, overstated the level of employment in the film industry deriving from Section 481 by 800%. Now that's pretty significant from a value for money point of view for the public. And you might tell us how many of those are, if you like, permanent jobs or even secure jobs. Because one of the things the Indicon report said way back in 1995 was that what you actually had was a series of micro companies with a very small number of permanent employees. And I would put it to you, that continues to be the situation. That there's almost nobody has any security of employment. There's absolutely nothing to protect workers from displacement, wholesale displacement, or even blacklisting, which has been alleged by workers in the industry. And can you riddle me this? Given that Section 481 says specifically that it is given on the proviso of the provision of quality employment and training, how can it be that your members in the Labour Court and the WRC, when challenged by workers over their employment rights, claim that the production companies who apply for and get the relief are not the employers? I don't see how you can get a relief to provide quality employment and training and then simultaneously claim that you don't employ the crew on those films, but hide behind a DAC, which is an accountancy tool. It's not a company. Even though the companies who actually apply are standing companies who exist year after year after year, Element, Metropolitan, you can go through the list. But they then claim we have no responsibility whatsoever for the employees. They're not our employees, they're not our trainees. And as a result, nobody has any kind of security. And in terms of training, I mean, can anybody even tell me how many trainees have qualified in the different categories of employment over the last 10 years?
I'm going to ring. I'm not stopping you, but allowing for the fact, because there's only a small number of us here, I've gone to 5 minutes on this, and then I'm going to let you come back in with some answers to what's been posed so far, and we'll have a further exchange. And I think we have another deputy obviously wants to come in as well. So, Elaine, over to you.
Okay, a lot of questions, but I would say, Deputy, that's fantastic that you welcome support of Section 481. Very well.
No, I said state support for the film industry.
Well, I'll take it as Section 481 for the moment.
I wouldn't necessarily.
Okay. Well, that's what we have at the moment, and that's what we're dealing with, and thankfully it runs until 2024. So I'll try and answer all of your points, and if I miss any, just let me know. Can I just take a step back and talk about the industry and how it's constructed? And I touched on it in the overview that I gave in the first 5 minutes. And I'll ask Stephen, actually, and Siobhan to speak to this, because they're company owners. The number of companies in this country, in terms of production companies, their role and their job is to create opportunities for employment. Okay, and I've set out what it is that those producers do and the kind of people that work as part of their core staff. The responsibility of producers is to find projects, create projects, get them funded, get them produced, make them successful, and give the opportunity to create the kind of employment that you're talking about, and that is the role. You talked about the EU directive around a permanent pool of talent, and I would focus on the word pool versus the word permanent. Thankfully, in this country, we have a fantastic pool of very, very talented crew that work across all of those genres: TV, documentary, drama you spoke about, and film. They have been available, they are available, they're incredibly talented, and we have a permanent pool of workers. In terms of what that looks like and what their day-to-day looks like, our industry is absolutely no different to any other territory where the screen industry that exists. It operates in exactly the same way. The role of the producer is to create the opportunity, to be enterprising and create employment opportunities and to add value to the economy. That's the role of the production company per se. Once that happens, and often they're managing the opportunity of 2, 3, maybe 4 projects at any one time, which is very challenging in its own right, that's when employment is created. To suggest that it could be any other way is really, it's not accurate. It can't be. The purpose of the pool is that you have available talent and crew when you need it, and we have. You'll remember after the Culture Committee Oireachtas hearings yourself back in January and February, I mean, the guilds, the film guilds of this country, organised as a direct result of what was being said at those meetings, to say to yourself and people who may have a different view of the industry about how their industry works for them and how they wish to work. Yes, it's project by project, but the point about what we do as professional producers is to create as many projects as possible, and ideally to have so many so as to operate and offer work 365 days a year. That's the model. That's not going to change. I'll move on to skills development. Actually, no, let me take a step back about this idea about not being supported in terms of security and the other words that you used around, the sense that perhaps people who are engaged and employed in the industry don't have protections. Like, we as employers are under the same scrutiny and subject to the same employment legislation as absolutely every other employer in the land. That's the first thing. The second thing is,
just for the deputies, we're going to try and keep this as tight as possible if we can to the tax question and the tax incentive question, because I appreciate Deputy Boyd Barrett did go into other areas, but I'm just conscious of time, and this is a budget committee. We are not revisiting, I made that clear beforehand, we are not revisiting the whole area of what the sectoral committee did earlier in the year.
Fair enough, but all of those obligations are tied to 481, and that's why.
Chair, just on a point of order, sorry, Elaine. See, the point is that the tax relief is explicitly in the finance legislation, tied to the issue of quality employment and training, so it is relevant.
Absolutely, I'm just trying to, for all our sakes, because I want to get Deputy Doherty in as well.
I'm happy not to refer to previous committee meetings, but it's really relevant because there are a number of obligations tied to Section 481 being received. And now, with the move to a self-assessment model, the producers themselves are individually required to declare that there is compliance with lots of things, including skills development, and you've got to put forward a plan in order to get certified in the first instance to be allowed to be considered for Section 481 at all. And secondly, with areas such as legislation and quality employment, and quality employment means adherence to all employment legislation. That's what it means in that context. So producers are required to individually and personally give a written declaration that they will be obliged to deliver all of those. So in the context of Section 481 as a relief in its own right, regardless of any of the discussions in any other committees, that's what is required of a producer. You wanted to speak about companies of scale, and why don't I defer to my colleagues who actually own a company?
Yeah, maybe I'll say something about companies of scale. I think if you're going to look at the concept of companies of scale, you have to understand the television and film business. There are three major sections within our industry: the animation industry, the factual industry, and the drama industry. And companies in all those three areas are always on a different scale. If you look at the factual industry, which is where Tile Films comes from, a company based in Dunleary, employs 10 people full-time and can employ up to 250 people when we're doing a production. We are of the same scale of your average factual company based in London, New York, LA. So I think when you're looking at Section 481 in terms of company of scale, you have to look at the individual areas. We have companies of scale here, as would be the norm across our industry, across the world. I mean, an animation company may have 200 or 300 people employed because of the nature of the type of work they make. A factual company will never have more than 10 to 15 people employed full-time because you're generating projects, so you have people in development, you have people in finance, and you have people going out selling those concepts to broadcasters around the world. Drama companies are a different animal because, again, you have more development work going on with scripts and so forth in a drama company. So a drama company, by its nature, will probably grow to be on a bigger scale. And we have companies on scale here, like Metropolitan Films and Element Pictures, for example, who are equally as big as a drama company in LA. So I think it's wrong to say that we're not building companies of scale here. I think every producer who works in this business is keen to build as big a company as possible. But actually, in reality, companies don't get beyond a certain size when they're not in production, because when a production company is not making something, it's developing something.
Yeah, I suppose
just on that and the companies of scale, that's not to say that there's not growth within the type of companies that we work in. If you take Crossing the Line, it started out in 1995 to make one film about the Irish Everest expedition, and now we're making, generally try to make 2 to 3 productions kind of in different stages at a different time. When you speak about project by project, it doesn't mean you finish one project, nobody knows where they stand, and then you start the next. You're constantly getting projects off the ground while you're working on another one. And I suppose Section 481 has been a key part of that growth. Like I know for us specifically, we would have made a project, The Secret Life of the Shannon, that would have gotten Section 481 funding. It was completely Irish financed. That added a layer of production value. It then went on to win awards. BBC and PBS wanted to license it for their channels, so that when we went to them with our next big natural history project, entirely about Ireland, made entirely with Irish crew, they wanted to be in at the start as full commissioning funders with a much larger budget. So suddenly, foreign funding from outside of Ireland was coming into the country, allowing us to make a much bigger scale project with budget doubling, eligible spend doubling, and that allowed us to grow our company, increase our number of permanent staff, employ a greater number of people on that production. Generally, in high-end creative documentaries, as Elaine was saying, it's not a 6-month shoot and then people are gone. You're in development. You could be filming over 2 years. When it's natural history, you're sitting in a hide waiting for a badger to do whatever he needs to do. And you're in a significant amount of post-production, crafting strong narratives. So these are films that travel across the world, not just stay within Ireland. So I think there is growth within the companies, as well as Stephen mentioned, the different companies of scale relative to the different sectors.
If there isn't anything particularly more, I'm very conscious of time. I want to let Deputy Doherty in, and then I can come back to you, Deputy Boyd Barrett, but I just want to let Deputy Doherty in.
Would it be possible to just give correct one set of numbers, because I think it's important.
Okay.
Sorry, Deputy Doherty, I just wanted to clear this up. There was a number given out at a previous session that you prefer me not to refer to in terms of the numbers working in the audiovisual sector. And Deputy Barrett, that number that was given on that day, not by ourselves, but actually refers to the Allsberg report, numbers of employed within the whole of the audiovisual industry. So instead of taking out the element that refers to film and TV and animation, which is that 7,070 that I quoted, it was incorrectly but not intentionally given as 17,000. It's actually 16,930. And then you mentioned that it was asked that a separate piece of work be done and that it was carried out. That piece of work was actually the cost-benefit analysis by the Department of Finance, who were in front of your committee, and gave another number around 2,000.
2,150.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's like comparing apples with oranges in one sense, because the data set is completely different. Finance, that particular cost-benefit analysis didn't look at post-production, for example, which is a huge part. A huge part of production. They came up with a whole set of other numbers over a different period of time. So there are economists that are much smarter than I am. But the point being, you're looking at 2 different pieces of information. That Allsberg number was a broad audiovisual number. If you drill down into our sector, the 7,070 number is correct and accurate.
Okay. Thank you very much. Deputy Doherty.
Thank you, and I want to welcome you to the committee. Can you just probably start out by outlining the benefits of Section 481, the actual financial benefits of Section 481 to a company that is in production? What are you allowed to offset in terms of the production costs, and does that include post-production costs?
Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a cultural benefit and there's a business benefit, obviously, in Section 481. So in terms of how Section 481 works, it's based on Irish eligible expenditure. And Irish eligible expenditure can be up to 80% of your total budget if your total production budget is pure Irish budget. So it depends if you're doing a co-production and filming work overseas. All that overseas work is non-eligible spend because it's outside the country. So it's 32% of the eligible expenditure in Ireland, and the eligible expenditure in Ireland is made up of goods and services and employment in the state.
So for a production that is solely based in Ireland, you're probably able to write off about a quarter, is it?
Yeah, well, it's 30.
Yeah, 32 of 80%. So
Yeah, 32 of the 80%.
Of certain expenditure, not all.
Yeah, okay.
So, for example, maybe I can give one of our own productions. We've just finished doing a big series called Aerial Britain for the Smithsonian Channel out of Washington, D.C. Like 60% of our company's turnover in Dún Laoghaire is export work. So it's money basically coming in to finance programs that we make for the international marketplace, particularly for the Smithsonian Channel. So on that project, it was all Irish crew, all Irish post-production, all Irish writers, all Irish composers. So the whole production is based out of Dún Laoghaire. But obviously the filming all took place in the UK.
Yeah.
So when the Irish crew step into the UK, and when the director goes to the UK, all that becomes non-eligible expenditure, but all the expenditure that happens out of the base is
of course. And that was going to lead me on to my second question. For the portion of the production that may take place in Britain, do you have a similar type of incentive or tax where you can write off some of the production that is taking place there? I'm just trying to get a sense of where our competitors are at.
Yeah, well, you could if you did an official co-production with another company in Britain, but because this project was financed by a broadcaster out of Washington, D.C., it was basically financed from Washington, D.C., and the Section 481 tax credit that made up the full financial package for the project.
Would the incentive, if you did a co-production, would the incentive in Britain be similar, less, more generous?
It's a more complicated one because there's a minimum of $1 million spent per hour to qualify for it,
so that
which
would
is
much
higher. So it's actually a lot of English producers would say to us that the Section 481, and that's why quite a lot of English productions come to Ireland, drama productions and things, because of the ratings.
There are 97 incentives globally that can be accessed of some form or another. They're all nuanced, but that's the number.
Okay, and just a couple of points. Look, I support Section 481. I think that there's huge opportunities in the film industry, and would like to see more activity in it, and particularly in the regions and so on. There is obviously concerns that have been discussed here, and I've raised them myself in relation to employment, quality employment, and so on. Can we just maybe drill into some of that there? You mentioned that the number of projects, certified projects last, or 2017 was 85. So that's 85 projects that availed of Section 481 tax relief. So, and of those, how many of those projects for that year equated to the figures that we're talking about here in terms of employment of 7,070 full-time equivalents?
So your question is around number of employees, or
during that, for those 85
I haven't broken that down. The numbers we're working off are formally from revenue as they issue them, so they wouldn't necessarily give you numbers of people attached to it per se. But the numbers that are generated in terms of the 7,000 came from the Alsberg audio-visual. And actually refers to 2016.
But so that's the entire industry, as opposed to the industry that is benefiting from Section 481.
The 7,000.
Yeah.
That's TV, animation, film, TV drama. Not all of which would benefit from 481, but probably the vast majority. And one of the challenges, Deputy, to be honest with you, is one of the promises with the Alsberg report was that there'd be a methodology to continue to analyse data in the industry and get these kind of statistics, such as you're speaking about right now. That wasn't brought forward as part of the report, which was eventually published last year. So the last data we have is for 2016. That's done in any great detail like that. So we'd actually, we're without it, which would be helpful to have it in some form or another, because all you're working on is top-line numbers from revenue as opposed to a deeper dive into what the industry is like and how it's structured. And the information is there. It's a matter of gathering it.
Yeah. So, like, if we were to look at kind of just a rough, if we were to say that all of those figures, and they should be collected, I agree with you, those full-time equivalents were companies that were availing of Section 481s.
Yes.
Then, as a rule of thumb, on average, each certified project that availed of Section 481 was employing about 80 full-time equivalents. Would that make some sense?
If you did it as a, as a blunt instrument across everything, but of course it's around hours and it's around genre. Like Stephen spoke about the kind of production that he makes, that's not comparable to, say, a Vikings. That could have 500 or 600 people on. No. It's not to avoid the question, but it's to say, like, what we really need is to do exactly what you're just talking about, is to talk about genre of production, when employment commences, what the numbers are, what the hours look like, how long you're on the project, and so on and so forth. And that's what we really need to do. As an industry ourselves, we're calling for it.
Should a production that, say, employs 40 full-time equivalents be availing of the same type of tax incentive that's linked to quality employment as a production that employs 400 full-time equivalents? I
think my colleagues have made the point for that. If you look at the depth of content and what's produced, and like we've another member who is based in Kerry, for example, that produced Ireland's Deep Atlantic. I would say with not a huge amount of staff, etc., but like that particular programme is now on the junior cert as part of the curriculum. So how do you measure value? It has to have a cultural impact as well. You have to be able to say that it leaves a footprint and that it has longevity, and also allows companies to leverage what they do. So when they go to PSB in the States or whatever, that you can actually build your company and build scale. So I think it's a blunt instrument to say X number of hours equals Y number of income, that there are a number of measures that have to be considered when you look at value.
Can I ask you, and these aren't necessarily my own views in terms of some of the earlier questions, but I'm just interested in your own views and the industry's views. But on this one here in particular, do you believe that there is an issue of concern in relation to employment rights within the industry?
I believe.
Do you think that there's room for improvement?
I believe that issue has clearly been raised, particularly through Deputy Barrett, etc. But could I let you know that, Minister Madigan as recently as May spoke about having a film forum, examining any concerns that might be raised by yourself, Deputy. And, suggested that the place to hear all of those things would be the Labour Court of the WRC. So Screen Producers Ireland, along with ICTU, we have just taken the initiative and approached the WRC to conduct an audit of our industry, which they have agreed to do, and they have invited public submissions on that. We've done it for a few...
Who's doing the audit, sorry?
The WRC.
Oh, the WRC.
Yeah. Because
I haven't heard a debate, and I know Deputy Barrett has raised his own issue, but I haven't heard a debate in relation to Section 481 in recent times where there wasn't support for investment by the taxpayer in terms of the arts and the visual arts and the film industry. But I also haven't heard a debate that didn't raise the concerns in relation to employment. And there is an issue where, while this is extended till 2024, and I'm sure the industry will hope that it's extended again beyond that. Okay, well, that unless these issues are addressed, you will be,
And we have provided an opportunity. We, as an industry, and the trade union movement have provided an opportunity now to have those issues heard. Your question to me is, do I think there are issues? I don't believe so, because we are legally required to, with 481, because it's pertinent to what this conversation is about, but as employers, we have legal requirements. There are personally signed declarations about commitment and compliance with all of these things. Certainly the industry is slightly different. It's not bricks and mortar. We're not producing widgets, but that doesn't mean we're special. That means that we still have to provide, proper employment, and that we have to adhere to all the legislation. So the opportunity to have these issues discussed is now, we have put it forward with ICTU, and I would suggest that everybody contributes to that process. And the other thing which I think it will do is that while we conclude national collective agreements under the ICTU group of unions, that will examine those agreements, will make sure that we've got best practice. If we don't, it will make recommendations, and it also allows, the Labour Court and the WRC to become familiar with the industry, warts and all. So
Can I ask two final questions?
Yes.
And I hear,
Sorry,
and it'll be interesting to see the working of that. But sorry, the chair is very rigid with his plug bug.
He is, unfortunately.
Even though there's only two of us here, he's still.
Well, the problem is,
I know we've another piece of work.
We'll be thrown out at 4:15 from this room. That's we have to
do something else.
To do after this.
Sorry. Look, I have two final questions, but I'm going to ask them together, right? So, the regional uplift that was introduced last year in the legislation, just talk to me about that.
Yep.
Do you believe that it's working? Do you believe, maybe if you can talk, or any of the companies can talk about the importance or what the effectiveness of that to the sector? It's obviously tapering out. Your views in relation to that. And then the second thing is, and I start with my earlier point about the support for the industry and to trying to nourish it and flourish it. And we're very, very proud, when we see the achievements, but also when we see some of the talent that is there and the productions on screen of the industry. So you've come here kind of basically arguing the case for Section 481, which is there anyway for the next number of years. What else could be done for the industry? It may not be tax or maybe whatever, but what else could be done to actually support this industry? And is there any opportunities that you see in the context of some of the stuff that is happening that Ireland needs to maybe grab with both hands and try and attract more investment, support the talent that we have here by additional productions and so on and so forth? So just to offer you that opportunity.
Sure. Well, on the regional uplift, was only written into legislation actually in July of this year, so it's taken a while, but is extremely welcome. I mean, most production takes place around Dublin and Wicklow, so opening it out beyond those areas is incredibly important. Two reasons really. One is it's costly to bring, crew with skills out of Dublin and, wherever, whether that be for Limerick. So it's incredibly important for places like Troy Studios, for example. The other thing in parallel with that, what it allows to happen is to develop skills within those regions so that in future when productions happen, you've got local crew. It's incredibly important. I mean, it's 5% and there are lots of obligations with that, by the way, but the focus is on looking into the local talent pool in that area and building a permanent talent pool outside the usual areas where production takes place. So really, really important, especially for incoming, especially for studio-based productions. Yeah, it's only for 4 years and it's tapered, so we need to look at it and see how successful it will be. As I said, it's only the very beginning, so maybe in a year's time you can ask me that, I'll let you know how it goes. I don't know if you want to contribute to that, but...
No, I think that's pretty much it. It is quite early to tell. I mean, it does, I know from a producer looking at it, it does make the idea of going, right, could we bring our production to a region much more attractive? So, when you're looking at the figures, you're going, right, could we actually do this in Kerry or Galway or Mayo rather than where we would have? So it is, you're always looking at, where's the bottom line? Could we do it? What are the extra costs? So I think it will cause a lot of people to see, could we? Yeah.
And Donegal's up there as well.
Yeah.
No, actually, we're working with Donegal at the moment who have, reached out and said, we have this issue, we've forgotten about, there ain't no train there, etc. So actually, specifically in the last week, we've been speaking to Donegal about all of this. I mean, there's a myriad of things that could be done, Deputy. I suppose our industry falls between a lot of stools in terms of government departments. The Audiovisual Steering Group examines all the recommendations of the Alsberg report, so you've everybody in the room, and that's really helpful. But I would really like our screen industry to be considered as an industry in its own right and to be championed. Because there is so much value, there are so many good stories, there are small, medium, big companies that are doing great things, and we tend to fall between all of these stools. So I think that it needs to be considered in the round that when you think of screen industries in particular, what do you think of? Yes, you think of drama, you think of film, you think of documentary and animation and everything in between. We have a fantastic story for Ireland in these really, really difficult times. We're going to be up against it with whatever, especially after today and what Brexit means. So we need to batten down the hatches. The UK are burgeoning with the amount of production that's coming through. Their studios are bursting. We need to make sure that, we've more studio space and that gets through planning permission, and we continue to grow our crew. Skills development is going to be fantastic. But I would love to be sitting at decision makers' tables as often as possible when we talk about Ireland Inc. and Ireland Screen Industries. I welcome Desiree Finnegan, who's the incoming CEO of Screen Ireland. It's going to, great to meet Desiree and what the plans are ahead. But they're our ambassadors when they leave these shores, and they need to be supported as well and able to sell brand Ireland for incoming productions. And I would finally say that if anybody has any concerns about any element of our industry, we are always open for business and for questions. Come out and visit a set. Come out to small sets. Go out, to documentaries. If you want to go into the hut on the nature programmes, come out to Ashford, Ardmore, whatever, and see for yourself. It's an open invitation. We'd love you to see that up close.
Thank you.
I'm going to Doherty's, I'm going to conclude Deputy Ryan. I'm going to go back, as I promised, to Deputy Boyd Barrett then for just a couple of quick questions to finish. And we, just for ourselves, apologies to, I think we have this room until 15:15. I think we'll probably be reinstating tomorrow's session, which we'll probably need now realistically to look at the pre-budget report.
We're not going to come to it.
What?
We're not going to come to it because I have to be gone by 3 anyway. So.
Sorry?
We're not going to come to the pre-budget report today.
If we do, we'll only have a few minutes on it. We won't get a full run-through on it, I think, at this time, being realistically. So, but we'll try and get something started. Sorry, apologies. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
First of all, just to clarify, I'm in favour of more public investment in the arts and the film industry, but not necessarily 4A1 for the reasons I've indicated. You see, first of all, you say that the particular nature of the industry means that companies of scale are actually much smaller. That's essentially what you're arguing. I put it to you, first of all, that's not the case with animation. Okay, they can do it. They can have a much bigger workforce that has some security of employment, right? I personally do not accept that that can't be done in live action film and TV. Okay, I just don't accept it. Given the amount of public money that is going in and the fact that largely that money is going to 7, 8, 9 companies, the bulk of it. So, and if, as you describe it, we've got 10 people in this company, 10 or 15 in that company, I mean, you add it all up, how many people have permanent jobs? 100, 200, 300? Okay, so that to me is a big problem, because that means all the rest, whether you say it's 2,000 or 7,000, have absolutely no security of income or employment from project to project. So that is how I put it to you, that is the situation, and that there is absolutely nothing to stop wholesale displacement of people who may have worked in the industry for years, or blacklisting, which has been alleged not just by some of those outside the ICTU fold, but even by the equity rep back here in January 2018, who said there was a big problem of bullying, harassment, and the workers had no protection. And see, my question is, who is the employer? Who is the employer of these people? Because the producer company is not, or at least that's what they're going into the WRC and saying, we're not the employer. And I don't see, I mean, if you take two bits of...
I'm sorry, because we've got just to that point. You made it.
No, but I just want to finish. No, I didn't actually.
20 seconds.
Yeah, I just want to... The Fixed Term Workers Act, okay, cannot apply if the employer is a DAC, which only exists for the purposes of one project. It simply cannot apply, and doesn't. And therefore, isn't it correct to say there's virtually nobody, or almost nobody, of that pool that you're talking about who have any kind of contracts of indefinite duration or any kind of expectation that they are right, if you like, to employment from one project to another? Or if you take another thing, that other workers, because you said there should be comparable with other employments, do most of those workers get sick leave, holiday entitlements, maternity entitlements? How many trainees have qualified?
To a conclusion at this point. I am sorry, and I'm going to be very apologetic to you in advance, but I'm going to ask you to be very brief in response to what was a very comprehensive question.
Yeah, it was. I'll be brief. I think, Deputy Barrett, you should have a look at the animation industry and maybe get to know it a little bit better, because the structure is completely different to live action, and it's not possible to compare the two. It's not, you know, it would just be helpful if you would maybe meet with Animation Ireland and work through how that industry works, because it is very, very different to live action and drama. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is, in terms of DACs, I mean, as producers who apply for Section 481, we're required to set up DACs, and those DACs are responsible for engaging the crew. And I have been in the WRC many times, happily, successfully, on occasions where the question has been around who is the employer, who is the DAC. It's very, very clear how the structure is set out with regard to Section 481 and where obligations are required. Are there contracts? Yes, there are. Is holiday pay paid? Yes, it is. All of those things occur. I really don't know how I can say it any clearer. There's no obfuscation here. It's very clear structure that we're required to adhere to. And I'll just leave with this. You talk about, permanent employees. If I'm a production company and I make one project a year that requires construction, and I don't make another project that requires construction for 4 years, is the suggestion that I take on a permanent staff of construction workers, because that's the right thing to do, even if I never make a project that requires construction, that can never work. It's not how it works. That allows people who work in construction or in whatever element of crewing they are to go and be hired for the projects that are suitable for their grades and for their talents. You cannot
what if you do, Elaine?
You can't have a production company based in Dublin or Waterford or Kerry that makes an array of projects and have full-time permanent staff that are irrelevant to the core of the organisation. It's not around marketing, it's not around funding, it's none of those things. Our job is to create those opportunities, and it's quite hard to get that done. That's why I'm really glad that we do it so well. It's not about that.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you. With that, I'm going to bring this session to a conclusion. I would like to thank Screen Producers Ireland for coming in. I'd like to thank you, Elaine, Siobhan and Stephen, for your contribution to us today. I'd like to thank the deputies for their interaction to it. We are now going to conclude this session and go into private session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.